Hi, and welcome to Alive with Chronic Illness, a podcast dedicated to exploring what it's like to live with and not in spite of chronic illness. Today, I'm joined by Aimee, who shares her experience of living with post-viral chronic fatigue.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Aimee.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
I thought that we could just sort of start off with a little bit of an overview of your experience of chronic illness and your journey to diagnosis.
Yes, so just a little bit about me. I'm 29 years old, living in London with a fairly normal office job. I've had chronic fatigue for just over 3 years, and I'm also the fatigued person behind the @Fatigue Diaries Instagram account. I started Fatigue Diaries last year because chronic illness can be very isolating, and I wanted to share my experience and connect with others who are also living life with chronic illness, but in a positive way that shares how I'm living with fatigue rather than just the struggles of fatigue. And I also wanted to be transparent about trying to manage fatigue in the workplace, as I was desperate to find anyone with advice or similar experiences when I got signed off on long-term sick leave. And I really like your statement in the introduction to this podcast, where you say that it's about exploring what it's like to live with and not in spite of chronic illness, because that's a lot of what I'm trying to share with my content as well. And to give some more detail on my chronic fatigue, my main symptoms are brain fog, a crushing mental exhaustion, feeling dizzy and slightly nauseous, and feeling both lightheaded and like my head is being weighed down or pressed in on all sides. And I don't suffer from physical fatigue, but my mental symptoms can make it hard to move around. And sometimes all I can face is lying down with my eyes closed because my head feels too heavy to do anything else. And then just to cover how I got diagnosed, my chronic fatigue started as post-viral fatigue following an extremely bad virus in November 2021. I had a cough and fever for 3 weeks, and it was similar to COVID, but I tested negative throughout, so it's much more likely to have been a bad flu. I was also living in a damp room at the time, so I was exposed to mold while I was ill, which likely contributed. And before I got ill, I had a fairly busy life, and I was a bit tired of the fast pace of London life, but I was otherwise healthy. But once the flu symptoms had gone, I tried to return to work. But it was like my brain was stuck in mud and I was weak and confused. And I vividly remember going into the office and being too tired to work out how to go home early. I literally couldn't get my brain to kick in enough to get me out of the building and to the bus home. And after a few days of that, I called 111 because I felt so awful. I was starting to worry it could be an emergency, and my GP practice was closed. And during that call, the doctor said that it sounded like post-viral fatigue, and everything just clicked because it matched my symptoms perfectly. So the next day, I booked a GP appointment, and then I had 6 months of blood tests and other checks to rule out other potential causes, which is essentially how they diagnose fatigue. They check it as in anything else. And then I was referred to the chronic fatigue specialists at around the 6 month mark. And in another 6 months, I met with the CFS specialists. And after that, I was diagnosed fairly quickly. So it took just over a year after becoming ill to be formally diagnosed. And I didn't have any other health complications, so it was quite clear from the beginning that it was post-viral fatigue. But even with that, it took a year. Then, once I got the diagnosis, I was referred to the NHS chronic fatigue programme, which I started a few months later in 2022. And that programme's more about self-management, which would have been very helpful earlier on in those very early days of fatigue. But by that point, I'd already researched and figured out a lot of ways to cope with chronic fatigue. But it was nice to have that targeted support and to feel less alone with trying to recover, which I know a lot of people with chronic fatigue experience. And I was fairly lucky throughout that my GP listened. They didn't brush it off. They instantly said, "We think this is post-viral fatigue." So all the way along, they were probably listening and testing. for that, which I'm very grateful for because I've heard a lot of people not having that experience. And I now have chronic fatigue slash ME, but it's essentially still post-viral fatigue. And the terminology just recognizes that it's a long-term illness.
And did you find then the self-management program that you went on, was it still helpful or was it just a little bit too late?
I think overall it was a little bit too late. I'm still technically a part of it in that I have follow-up sessions every few months. It was helpful in that it made me fully analyze everything that I do. You start with looking at your sleep schedule and learning about the circadian rhythm and about light management and about pacing. So it was helpful in that it confirmed a lot. I did extensive research. Whenever my brain was in gear enough, I was researching. So I had worked out a lot of it on my own. I think it was helpful in that it confirmed that what I was doing was essentially all I could be doing. Um, and it was nice to have that support. It also meant that I was really checking in on myself to check that I was doing the things that I thought, going to sleep at the time that I'd planned and trying to get daily fresh air and all these small things. But that in itself isn't going to cure fatigue. It is just helping to manage it. So I think it's a great program, but it does really summarize that we still don't really know how to cure fatigue. Um, but no, I would recommend it if you can get on it, because obviously it's a long waiting list.
No, it's good to know that it's worth it, but yeah, it does seem like it sums up a lot of really key topics there. But often, I think, particularly myself, when we research these topics come up anyway as well.
Yeah, and I think I was feeling quite confident in what I'd researched and also in the fact that I used to live a fairly sort of healthy lifestyle before, so a lot of it just made sense to me. It was just about looking after yourself, trying to live more in tune with nature and making sure you get that sort of proper light in the mornings and that you're not looking at screens in the evenings to get your brain into that really good rhythm. So yeah, I think, actually I would say if you're someone that's waiting to get onto that program, trusting your instincts and doing your own research, actually that got me to probably the same level that the program would have got me to.
That's really reassuring to hear. So it's had a very big impact on your life and on your work as well. Did you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's had a huge impact on every aspect of my life. And before November 2021, just to give an example of what my life used to look like, I was healthy, active. I had a huge amount of hobbies. I loved visiting new places and weekend trips to see friends. I had a job that involved a few early morning and evening events, so there was always something exciting happening. But at the same time, I always made sure to get a good night's sleep. I practiced mindfulness and meditation. I was eating healthily. So, sort of staying healthy and having a balanced life was always something that I just enjoyed and took for granted. But then in the early months of the fatigue, and to different extents ever since, I've had to stop almost everything. And the majority of my time was spent lying or sitting up in bed. In the first couple of months after the virus that caused the fatigue, I was only really awake for a couple of hours a day. I was too tired to talk or do basic tasks like cooking. And that was not because of physical fatigue, but because my brain couldn't handle doing even things that used to feel easy. I was still sleeping well at night, but I was spending 12 to 14 hours asleep and then a lot of the day lying on the sofa in a sort of semi-waking doze. At first, I was at home with my family as it was over Christmas, and I remember not having the energy to reply properly when they were talking to me and sort of going, to show that I was listening. And I could only read or watch television for extremely short amounts of time. And the early days were extremely blurry when I tried to remember them. I could barely send a text or reply to an email. And for some reason, washing my hair would just wipe me out for the entire day, even though I didn't have physical fatigue. It was a very mental thing. But there were certain things I just couldn't handle doing. And I think I was in denial about how bad it was at first. And throughout most of the illness, I've tried to keep some semblance of normality in my life. I've kept working. I've kept living in London in shared houses with housemates, which isn't always the most relaxing. And I've tried to still do some of the things that I enjoy. But I think if I'd realized the scale of how bad it was at first, I probably should have moved back in with my parents for more support. And if I'd been even slightly more ill, it wouldn't have been possible for me to even attempt to live on my own or continue working. And aside from the practicalities of looking after yourself and working with a chronic illness, it's just very isolating. I live in a shared house in London, and while I see my housemates regularly in passing, most days I don't have meaningful time spent with others. My friends are spread all over London. My family are about an hour's journey away, and it takes a lot of energy to see them. And they're very understanding and supportive, but the reality is they're just very busy with their lives, so they can't always come to see me as much as I would like. And I'm in a slightly better place health-wise now, so I can see a friend or two at the weekends. But the reality is that if I'm not feeling well enough to go out and socialize, then I'll be at home on my own, likely lying flat in bed. Um, and I also used to love going into the office and seeing my colleagues and having a chat in the kitchen. And that's another level of socializing that gets taken away the second you're not well enough to work or even have to work from home. And obviously, exercise. I used to love exercise. And although my fatigue is mental rather than physical, the heavy-headedness and the mental exhaustion can make it really difficult to move. And sometimes that makes me feel motion sick if I move too much. So it does affect everything. And just having enough waking hours to do everything when you spend a lot of time in bed is also something to take into account. Um, and when my fatigue was at its worst, I was too exhausted to feel bored or like I was missing out because my mind was so completely overwhelmed by just existing. And one of the first signs that I was recovering was starting to feel like I wanted to do more than I actually could do with my fatigue. And then just looping back to work. It's affected my work life in sort of fluctuating way. I have managed to stay employed throughout, but with periods of extended sick leave. And initially, I had to take time off work, and I took about a month at first, plus time over Christmas, which in retrospect was a ridiculously short period of time, considering how unwell I was. And if I could go back, I would tell myself to just be more serious about it, take more time off work, to not try and return as if I wasn't like really ill. And that initial period off was followed by an informal phased return and trying to continue in my job for about another year and a half. At that point, I was somehow managing to look after myself and continue doing my job, but I knew something needed to change. So I decided slightly irrationally to change jobs. And I took a couple of months off work before starting my new role. The new role then led to a relapse, a period of extended sick leave, and my most recent phased return, although I'll discuss that in more depth later. So it's it has affected everything really, and I have recovered a lot in the 3 years since my post-viral fatigue started, but I'm still extremely far from being recovered. And when I'm looking for kind of signs that I am recovering, that includes things like being able to get through most days without napping, having moments of mental clarity without the brain fog, being able to do gentle exercise, and having enough energy to feel excited about life and hobbies again, even if I can't necessarily do all of the things that I'm excited about. And I'm now back to full-time work, but with a lot of measures in place in my life around work to make that possible. So, yeah, it's quite all-consuming, but at the same time, you do continue to live through it in some way.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, isn't it? Like when we're going through these experiences, we are still living. We might be experiencing fatigue, we might be asleep for long hours a day, but we are still alive. And I think you picked up on some really important points there when you were talking about how when the fatigue was at its worst, you didn't even have the energy to feel bored because it was so bad that you
Yeah.
didn't have space for it.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's almost a survival mechanism of the body to sort of, I sort of looking back, I think how did I spend so long doing absolutely nothing. And even now, I spend long periods resting where I'm not really doing anything. And it is the brain just sort of shuts down. And in a way, it's almost slightly worse when you begin to feel a little bit better and begin to go, oh, this isn't what I want to be doing. But my brain's still often too tired to be doing anything else. But yeah, it can really sort of just make your brain shut down.
Yeah, and I've had I broke my ankle a couple of years ago and I had like quite a bad period of time in my health after that while I was trying to rebuild the strength and trying to recover from it. And then I experienced similarly when I started being able to do more, there was almost like it was good because I knew that I was being able to do more, but it was also kind of bad because I all of a sudden was thinking, oh, I've just lost or felt like I'd lost all this time when I was so unwell that I couldn't do anything that I didn't really think about at the time because I was just surviving. Like when we went through that, we were just surviving. So
Mm.
it was only when I came out the other end and I thought, oh, this is what life is supposed to be like, or this is what life was like before, because I had kind of almost lost the concept of it. And I think that you said there, it is that survival mechanism just to get yourselves through it, really.
Yeah, and then in a way, the transitional phase is more frustrating because you begin to get the urges to try and live more normally, but you're just still not well enough to do that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And you touched briefly on the phased return to work, but do you want to talk a little bit more about what that looked like for you, how you went about approaching that?
Yes, so I've had two experiences of a phased return to work, and I'll outline the first briefly, but I'll focus on the second as the first phase return was handled more informally, which I've since realised is quite unusual. So the second is more useful as an example for others, I think. So once the flu symptoms had gone back in 2021 and I tried to return to work, I took roughly 6 weeks off sick around Christmas to try and recover. And then I did an informal phased return of working for a couple of hours a day and then increasing over a couple of months. But we didn't really have a set plan. It was more just what I could manage at the time, which was actually, in retrospect, wonderful. But I then went up and down for a year, taking days off sick when needed, but generally trying to struggle through and keep doing my role. Then I decided to change jobs because I knew I needed a change and I wanted to steer away from a role that involved a lot of external contact, such as answering the phone and replying to emails or running events, whilst also trying to do my other work projects, because I'd started to realize that juggling was extremely mentally draining. So I applied for a role in a different company that was more senior but more internal rather than dealing with external contacts. And I knew from the start that I wanted to take a couple of months off work in between roles, and I negotiated that when I was offered the job. And I'm really glad I did that because those 2 months were essentially sick leave for me. They really helped me to feel slightly better and ready to take on a new job. And it's also worth noting that I brought up the fact that I had health complications in my interview, which I know is generally not advised. And when I was offered the job, they were really clear that they had taken into consideration that I was unwell, and they still felt I was the best person for the job. So being transparent worked well for me in that instance. And it also gave me some extra confidence for starting a new job with a chronic illness, which was really nice. I then started the new role after that 2 month break, and I didn't put any specific measurements in place for the fatigue other than working mostly from home, as I was hoping that I'd be able to manage the fatigue around working, and I was feeling a lot better after that 2 month break. Unfortunately, it was an extremely high workload, and by Christmas 2023, I was in a really bad place with my fatigue again. My manager at the time was incredibly supportive and asked what I needed to be able to continue working. And we agreed that I would work Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, taking the days in between as sick leave to allow time for me to rest and recover. But my workload was unchanged, and in retrospect, this working pattern led to me working very intensely without any breaks on the days that I was working to try and keep up with 5 days worth of heavy workload in 3 days. And as anyone with chronic fatigue knows, consistency is important for pacing. And I'd basically set up my own boom and bust cycle on a daily basis. which was completely my fault. I was asked what I needed and I suggested that, but I just didn't know better at the time. And by May 2024, I was really unwell. My fatigue and brain fog had got so bad that I honestly can't believe I was still managing to work in any capacity. And I was still churning out work and meeting deadlines. But I kept finding myself zoned out whilst out and about, which was scary, or just staring into the middle distance with no idea how long I'd been doing it. And I was feeling so constantly tired and confused that I was living almost on autopilot. And it was at that stage that I signed myself off sick from work for 2 weeks with a note from my doctor. In 2 weeks, I wasn't feeling any better, so I got another note, and it carried on like that for about 6 weeks before my company arranged an occupational health appointment for me. And I was feeling really hopeful about the occupational health appointment. While I was off ill, I was so worried about trying to return to work and if I'd be well enough to even try to return. So this felt like a positive step to get some professional advice. And the first appointment signed me off for another month with a further review booked in. The next review advised that I have 4 to 6 more weeks off and then start a phased return that would see me back at my full contracted hours within 1 month. At the time, I agreed because I was exhausted, I was desperate to keep my job, and I wasn't sure what alternatives to suggest. In the end, I took the full 6 weeks off before starting my return. And I was feeling slightly better after all of that time to look after myself, but I was extremely concerned about my fatigue levels and how I'd cope with the fast-paced return, or even staying awake long enough to do the hours without napping. And then to give an idea of what my phase return looked like in terms of hours and how I progressed, I started with 50% of my normal contracted hours, working from 11 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. with an hour lunch break for 2 weeks' time. And that stage was hard, but about manageable. And my workload was actually being controlled at this point to make sure I didn't have more work than I could manage in my working hours, which made a huge difference. And also just helped to manage the stress of returning to work when you're not feeling your best. After that, I moved to 2 weeks at 75%, and that was meant to be followed by a return to full-time work. But I was finding the 75% stage harder, and fortunately, I managed to negotiate with my company for a slightly longer timeline to increase from the 75% to 100% of working hours. And this looked like a further 2 weeks at 75% and a month at 85% before moving back to full-time. And this was still hard, but it was just about manageable and it allowed me more time to get used to each stage of pacing. But even with that extension, the only way I managed to return to full working hours was because my fatigue symptoms were becoming less severe at that time, because I'd been putting in a lot of pacing and a lot of rest and trying out a lot of new things whilst I'd been on sick leave. If they'd carried on at the level I was experiencing during my sick leave, I just wouldn't have been able to cope. And there weren't any allowances in the phased return for pausing or needing to extend further. So I think there's definitely work to be done with the general idea of phased returns around chronic illness to allow for some flexibility. And throughout the whole thing, I felt like my job security was very uncertain and that I was constantly trying to prove that I was well enough to do my job, because the phased return meant I had to be working like a healthy person within a set time frame, which is quite hard when you're obviously not actually well. I did negotiate some longer term adjustments with my company, and I do really appreciate some of these, and they're a large part of why I've managed to keep working. For example, being able to take short breaks throughout the day, being encouraged not to accept or set up back-to-back meetings, being able to set boundaries around work that is not technically in my job description, and of course, taking a full lunch break and logging off on time. And a lot of these are basic rights and should be the norm for mental and physical health at work. But as I'm sure many people working in corporate environments know, it's so easy to start skipping breaks and sitting in calls for hours, especially when deadlines are coming up or the workload is too high. So I'm really grateful that my company, I had a discussion and I know that my company is aware that I'm doing that and they condone it. So I don't almost feel guilty for saying to someone, "Oh, could we have this meeting half an hour later?" Or some, or that if I'm away from my desk for 10 minutes because I need to just get some fresh air, no one's going to look at my Teams and realize that I've been offline and ask why. So that has really helped in just basic management of the condition while at work. And I have been working from home during my phase return, which is another huge factor in making the return possible. I did have some difficulties towards the end of the phased return, as my occupational health provider hadn't specifically recommended working from home, because when I was speaking to them, we didn't have any policies that stated a certain amount of time in the office, and up until that point, I'd been allowed to do whatever I needed to get my job done. Whilst I was off sick, a 60% on-site policy was introduced, which would have been 3 days on site a week. And that just wouldn't have been possible with my fatigue, and probably won't be for a while, I imagine, if ever. And initially, my company were pushing for me to start phasing back into the office 3 days a week, starting at 1 day a week. And I spent several weeks negotiating. Unfortunately, they supported me submitting a flexible working form, which anyone in the UK can submit, I believe. And in that form, I asked to be allowed to work primarily from home, with time in the office when my health allowed and when specifically required for my job. And the process was uncertain and stressful, but I've had a good outcome, as it's been agreed that I need to go into the office a minimum of 4 times a month, and that could just be for a half day, which I find easier to manage. And I'm really happy that I managed to have that agreed because I love being in the office. I like seeing my colleagues. And I think, it is important to have that human contact outside of the house. But I need to balance that with the realities of living with a chronic illness. And I think this flexible working will allow me to do that. And in the last few months, it seems to have been working. So I'm now working full time, mostly from home, with 1 to 2 afternoons per week in the office. I have to be very careful about managing my fatigue around work and during the working day to make sure that I can manage this amount of work without going downhill. I would say my quality of life outside work is of a lower quality than I would like, as I have to prioritize being well enough for a day's work, and it potentially is slowing down my recovery in the long run, but it's honestly the best outcome I could have imagined when I first got signed off sick and thought that I might have to give up my job. I don't know what would happen if my fatigue got worse again, because I don't know if my company could support the same process twice. There's still a lot of grey area, but my fatigue has been stable, if not improving, for the 5 months that I've been back. And I think I've learnt a lot and put a lot of measures and pacing in place to try and avoid a long-term flare-up. But it is just a case of taking every day as it comes and not worrying too much about the future.
Yeah, and you touched on something, a couple of things actually that were really important there. One, that often, even if people are on reduced hours to be more accessible, they might still be expected to work as if they didn't have a disability, which is just not, it's just not sustainable. Or in your case, when you went down to 3 days, you're expected to do the work of 5 days in three, which that's not healthy for anyone.
Yeah, and I think it can be difficult because even now everyone's very understanding, but I'm very conscious that if I were to take a sick day for chronic fatigue rather than because I've got a cold or something, that will be noted and logged and thought about in terms of my phased return and whether or not long term this could be an issue for the job, because obviously it can be seen as making you less reliable. And I've been fortunate that with the way that my workload's being managed and the way that I'm managing my fatigue, I haven't needed to take off sick days specifically for the fatigue. But it's always in the back of my mind that, I need to be trying to act as much as possible like a healthy person. And my team are aware and supportive. But if on a daily basis I was being brutally honest about how I feel when someone says, "How are you?" Um, that might come as a bit of a shock.
Yeah, and I think that's it, isn't it? Like what we experience on a day-to-day basis with pain, fatigue, whatever people are going through, we do have to kind of hide it a bit. I wish we didn't have to, but there seems to be like this societal expectation that we could appear as non-disabled as possible, which makes it really hard to be able to have open conversations. Even like the one we're having right now, it makes it difficult. And the information out there and that support that you can hear that other people have been through, something similar, makes a big difference. And you also touched on the fact that now outside of work, your quality of life isn't as good as you would like. And I wondered if I could ask you to elaborate on that a little bit and I guess how you feel about that, because I understand obviously we need to work to have a living. And it's that balance, isn't it, between having a job that, and go to work, but also making sure that you're still having enough time for your health and for your well-being as well.
Yeah, so I think my quality of life, like it's okay enough. Otherwise, I would seriously be considering whether I should be continuing working. And I think for me, it's balanced out by the fact that the lack of stress that comes with having a salary and also having a sense of purpose. I genuinely like my job and I like the people I work with. And so I think it's worth, to me, it feels worth it because the stress of taking long-term sick leave and or giving up your job entirely, that's everybody's last resort. And I think I do feel grateful that I've managed to reach a stage where I can work. But my waking hours around work during the week are very reduced. I tend to like to be in bed by 8. Between working and finishing work and going to bed, I tend to have just had dinner, maybe chatted to a housemate, read a little bit or watched something, but then by 8, I want to be in bed, winding down, asleep by 9. So there's not really time to do anything like exercise. The days of thinking I might see a friend for dinner during the week are long gone. And having that, and even going to bed at 9, I'm still generally waking up probably between 8 and 9 a.m. in the morning. So there's not a huge amount of time before work either, because I will just wake up. I always make sure I do a meditation and start the day slowly. But then I'm generally just getting up, getting ready for work, having breakfast, and sitting down at my desk. So during the week, and I know many people have this with corporate jobs, it takes up your whole life, but it's frustrating, I suppose, when technically I'm working hours where I should have quite a lot of time around work to look after myself and see friends and do hobbies. So it affects me in that way. And also some weekends, sometimes I just spend weekends recovering from the week. I have been recently making more plans at weekends and doing some nice things, but it's always in the back of my mind, I can't risk this causing a flare up because I need to be well enough to work on Monday. So I suppose it just really reduces the amount that I can do. And if I have a stressful day at work, it does, sometimes I'll feel really foggy and dizzy in the evening, if I haven't paced sort of correctly during the day. So it's it's manageable and I don't feel too bitter about it, I suppose, because I know that it sort of is the best case scenario. And I also really hope that if I'm consistent with everything I'm doing, I will continue to see recovery in my chronic fatigue. And I think I'm fortunate in that with chronic fatigue, there are many examples of people recovering in the end or managing to live almost normal lives. So I suppose I'm managing it for now in the hope that one day I might have a few more hours in the day around work to actually do things that I enjoy.
Yeah, and it is all about that balance, isn't it? If it brings you the fulfillment and the structure and having the lack of stress around an income, I think that those sort of things like worrying about like how you're going to pay the bills doesn't help chronic fatigue either. So yeah, you've got a really good point there.
Yeah, and I think, I was faced with the option of, I mean, I'm really fortunate that I had the option that I could have moved back with my parents and given up my job and stopped paying for rent. But that decision to sort of give up the life that you have built and the place you're currently living and a job that you actually really like, that is a big decision. And I think I really feel for people that aren't in the stage where they can consider starting work again because it shouldn't be our whole lives. And I do feel that I really hope that in the future work won't be the main focus of my fatigue recovery. But it does make a big difference having that stability and the freedom essentially, and the freedom to pay for if you need medical treatments or if, I sort of considered one or two things that the NHS couldn't offer. I could do that if I'm working, but if I'm not working, you do have to be a lot more careful with anything you're spending money on.
Yeah, that's a very good point. There is a lot of things that aren't necessarily funded, and you do have that freedom then with that comes with having an income. I think yeah, it is very valid, and I'm sure there probably are many people listening who maybe they're experiencing something similar and they're finding that it is pretty much all of their energy is just going to work, and it shouldn't have to be like that, but unfortunately it is for many disabled people.
Yeah, it really is. And I went for a blood test recently, and the nurse who was doing the blood test said she also had chronic fatigue and was in exactly the same situation for me, but, literally working for the NHS as a nurse. And I think that really made me realize that there are so many people who are just desperately trying to keep working, and that is the main focus of them managing their fatigue. And I think it's a shame that it's so normal, and but at the same time, weirdly, it almost feels like a privilege to be at a stage of recovery where I can try and work.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So what do you think worked well for you with that phase return, and was there anything that really didn't work and that you would probably change or advise people to consider if they were looking at a phase return?
Yeah, so I'll start with what didn't help me and end with the positives. Um, the first thing that I found made my progress very difficult was the occupational health advice that I received. And this was from an external provider arranged by my company. So they were specialists in occupational health advice. It was definitely necessary in the process, but the occupational health advisor I dealt with seemed completely out of their depth with chronic illness. And the two sessions I had were very frustrating and left me feeling hopeless, which I want to mention in case anyone else is in the same position. I went in feeling really hopeful that they'd be able to provide the advice I needed, and I was really thrown by the experience. In the first session, they were helpful as they advised a month of work to be reviewed by them again at the end of that time. But in the second session, they kept asking things like how far I could walk without resting when I'd explained my fatigue affected my mental capacity rather than physical. And we kept going round in circles with similar sort of not quite appropriate questions that I think they had on a sheet that they needed to tick various boxes. And they just didn't seem to have any understanding of chronic fatigue. And then the sort of return they advised wasn't suitable for a long-term illness. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done with employers and occupational health advisors around long-term illness in the workplace. And in the weeks following my second occupational health appointment, I did some research and realised that I'd been recommended a phased return that was far too fast, just didn't fit for chronic fatigue. And I was worried about even the first stage. And I then had to do a lot of research and advocating for my health and what I needed with my company to essentially undo the incorrect advice given by the occupational health advisor. They also advised moving to a part-time contract in my occupational health meeting, and that would have been for 3 to 6 months. But that was rejected straight away by my company as they just couldn't have offered that, which I do completely understand. But it meant that overall, the advice I got from the occupational health advisors seemed like a combination of incorrect advice and advice that could be ignored by my company if they couldn't support it. And there were two other things recommended by occupational health that I didn't find useful, but someone else might, so I wouldn't rule them out completely. The first was CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and my company paid for me to have 6 sessions of CBT, which I'm really grateful for because I don't have any kind of health insurance through my job. But the sessions weren't really useful as they were covering the basics that I'd worked out for myself in the early stages of having chronic fatigue. And they were also focusing on a mental state and staying positive, which I've really fortunately been able to do. And I think it may have been useful if I'd come across it during the first stages of fatigue when I was struggling to come to terms with it and how to live with it. But it definitely isn't a cure, and I didn't find it useful. And I feel like it was perhaps suggested to my company almost like a cure. So that it wasn't a negative experience, but I don't feel that it helped. And the second thing advised by occupational health was filling out a mental health wellness plan. as supplied by Mind charity. And my company were very supportive of me filling this in. But I found it came back to haunt me because the questions surrounding stress and mental health in the form brought up conversations around handling stress, as if the problem was that I couldn't manage stress properly, and also whether it would be possible for me to continue in my role, which can be quite intense at times, if stress was a factor that made my fatigue worse. And I think if the whole team had filled in a mental health wellness plan, it would have been a more even playing ground. And but because it was just me, it turned into a discussion about whether I was well enough to do my job and if I could handle it. And I think it's a hugely positive document for companies to be using, but it should be issued company-wide and not used in specific cases to deal with chronic illness, which isn't what the form is meant for. And it then singles out one employee much further. So I think it was slightly concerning that the occupational health advisors recommended that form, which I just don't think was fit for purpose in that case. But moving on to the more positive things and the things that actually really helped me. The first was the flexible working form, which I've already mentioned, but it was a huge help and it's allowed me to formally agree working from home most of the time. And it can also be used to agree a different working pattern if your workplace is open to that. So I think that's something that could really help a lot of people. ACAS is another thing that really helped me. They offer free online advice on all sorts of workplace issues, including long-term illness. And I checked my rights on there and even called one of their free lawyers at a point when I thought my phased return wasn't going to work and I'd be forced to resign. And they're a really useful free support. Action for Aimee's website has also been really useful for advice on how to begin working out what sort of phased return you might be up to doing and what sort of thing companies can offer, which I wish I'd known about earlier and I only found in the sort of later stages of my phased return. And then also just checking all the policies for my workplace, because that gave me more confidence when I was pushing for the changes that I needed to be able to carry on working. A lot of the policies had grey areas around long-term illness, so it wasn't always clear, and I think that's probably the case in a lot of companies. But at least I knew what was covered in the policies. That was tiring and the last thing I needed on top of returning to work, but it's also something that I would recommend doing because it just gives you that peace of mind that you know the ground that you're standing on. And then the NHS CFS programme, which we have already discussed a bit. And although I don't feel the programme overall has helped with my fatigue recovery, just because it did come a bit too late, the programme team were really useful for trying with support when I was trying to work through my illness, because they wrote a letter to my employer explaining the effects of CFS and ME in a lot of detail, and also basically explained that I was the expert in knowing how to deal with my health and that they should trust me and that it was, a serious illness, which I think is very important, especially for what is essentially an invisible illness. So I think that helped because it took away any uncertainty within my workplace about whether or not I was actually ill, because at work I was masking completely. I was, until the point where I was really not well enough to work, I was doing my best to seem like I wasn't ill at work. So I think that letter was really helpful to explain to my line manager and my HR department the realities of the illness. And the sort of final thing was that I was very lucky in having a supportive team through my illness, and nobody made me feel guilty for having to take time off, even though it left them in a difficult position. And they've been very understanding about CFS in a way that has made my return to work much easier, and I'm very grateful for that. I really hope that we're moving into a time of greater understanding for chronic illness and disabilities, and that this isn't just a case of me being very lucky with my colleagues. But at the same time, I know I was very lucky because there are instances where people have really struggled with their colleagues and dealing with a chronic illness. And the final thing that really helped me through the uncertainty of my sick leave and my phased return was reminding myself that my employer was learning too, because companies aren't really set up to deal with long-term illness. And I had to trust that they were trying their best too. So I think that's something I really hope changes in the future, that there are clear paths for working with a long-term illness. But yeah, I just had to remind myself it was a learning curve for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it as well, and just have that trust as well, especially if you can have build that trust to think, yeah, we're all learning here. Hopefully it will be better in future. And I think that's something that I strongly advocate for. But yeah, trusting that your employer has your best interests at heart, which is not always easy and it's not always the case, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But and there was definitely a lot of things like as you shared there, like things that went well, things that didn't go as well, and particularly around like stress management. Like you said, I'd imagine if most people in your workplace, if I filled in that form, I probably would come up as question mark on can I manage my stress? Because a lot
Yeah.
of people do struggle with managing stress because it is stressful to work and yeah, it is challenging. But thank you so much for sharing your experience so openly. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I hope that it may help someone else that's going through the same situation, because at the time, as it's probably clear from my summary, I didn't really know what I was doing and I was learning at each stage and it was all very uncertain. And I think it's probably the same for every phased return, in that it probably won't feel easy or secure. So the only thing you can do is just keep working through it and keep trying to ask for what you need. But yeah, it is an uncertain process, and I just hope that hearing my slight sort of roller coaster of a journey might help somebody else. And also the fact that at the moment it's worked and I am back at work. I've managed to get some measures in place to allow me to continue working, and I just have to hope that that will continue. But at the moment, it's been a really positive outcome.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I hope work continues to move forward in a sustainable way for you.
Thank you. I hope so too.
Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's been a delight.
You can follow Aimee on Instagram at Fatigue Diaries, where she shares her experience of living with post-viral fatigue. You can find a link to her social media in the description. Be sure to follow to keep up to date with the latest episodes. And as always, thanks for listening.